the Federal Reserve, the central bank of the USA, says that a strategic Bitcoin reserve is the dumbest idea there is. Jerome Powell stated that the Federal Reserve doesn't want to buy Bitcoin. Now we have confirmation from Periane Borring. Jerome Powell stood up and said that the Federal Reserve does not want to buy Bitcoin here. Now there's further confirmation from an insider leak from Periane Borring, who was invited to a meeting with representatives of the Federal Reserve. Bitcoin was also mentioned here. She clearly talked about Bitcoin here. She asked the people who were there what it looks like. What do you all think about a strategic Bitcoin reserve? Watch out, what's happening here is she was laughed at. She was told it's the dumbest idea possible that you can possibly imagine. You wouldn't be taken seriously. She even says that the Federal Reserve was about to throw her out of the building. They were about to throw her out of the building. She also says that there will be major controversies if a Bitcoin reserve strategy goes through. It's worth mentioning Periane Borring was also on Natalie Bloom's podcast where she talked about this shocking event. She's really well known for her cool statements about Bitcoin. She's also very, very bullish about it and so on. Does she also wear that here at the Federal Reserve since she's already invited? What it looks like with a strategic Bitcoin reserve. And she was just laughed at. And now we have to be careful. Because I said that before. There was also a statement from Scaramucci who said that if you really want to push through an extreme Bitcoin reserve in the US, then you need a whole lot of support. That means the more extreme it is, the more support you need. If you just want to convert the 200,000, let's say, confiscated coins, if you want to convert a strategic Bitcoin reserve, then you don't need that much here. Support in the banking committee, in the Senate, at the Federal Reserve. And so maybe you can make it work somehow. But the more extreme you go with it, for example, if you take it that far, like Cynthia Lummis selling gold or even printing her own money to buy Bitcoin, then the banking committee, the Senate, and the Fed all have to be involved. And accordingly, it's even more important that as many people as possible are on board and convinced about this Bitcoin reserve. And on the political side, that's the case now. The whole Trump team is pro-Bitcoin, and more Democrats are flipping too. And all those old goons, all the Elizabeth Warrens and so on, who have been blocking things, they're slowly fading away. That means even in the Democratic camp, it's slowly shifting pro-Bitcoin. We represented Bitcoin in the banking committee, and what's the only thing missing is here at the Federal Reserve. It looks like there's an absolute blockade here, not just from Jerome Powell, but also from other folks at the Fed. Of course, we don't know from this leak who exactly the insider was or who exactly, let's say, the employee from the Federal Reserve was. Not the insider, but the employee from the Federal Reserve who shared this publicly. Periane Borring was the insider who brought this to the public. We're going to check out the clip in just a moment. And that's really explosive because it also shows the true face here, the Federal Reserve, and that they're afraid of Bitcoin. If they weren't afraid of Bitcoin, they wouldn't be pushing back so hard against it. And here they just laugh it off. Maybe they just haven't understood it yet. Maybe Michael Saylor just needs to have an orange pill session with them, that they understand that even the US dollar can benefit from Bitcoin. What's also interesting is that Senator Cynthia Lummis was once asked, what happens when the Fed is completely blocked? And Cynthia Lummis just said, yes, no problem at all. If we issue an executive order or pass pro-Bitcoin legislation, then we can just change the rules. Can say that the Fed has nothing more to say here. We can then say that somehow the mandate at the Fed or something like that is changed. And I'm not exactly sure how that happens legally. Shouldn't really, let's say, dwell on that. But there are definitely ways here. How to outsmart the Fed here. That was Cynthia Lummis's statement. That means she even says, even if the Fed is against Bitcoin, if Donald Trump wants to pull this off for us, bypass the Fed with support, bypass. But of course, the easier it is, the more support you have here. And then maybe you don't have to deal with any at all. What do I know about all these complicated things to force the Fed? Instead, they could basically do it on their own. But Jerome Powell also makes it very clear that right now, there isn't the legal framework to even buy Bitcoin. That's pretty clear, of course, that even if they wanted to buy Bitcoin here, it wouldn't be possible. The legal framework, that has to be done first. But now check out this clip from Periane Borring, the one here.
She was just a guest on Natalie Brunell's show and really dropped a bombshell. I just last week had a meeting in Washington, D.C. with members of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve, and when I brought this up, they never said anything about it. Like, why does it? And I saw it's a board. I'm at a table here, and the fox in a broom at the father casting thing. This is the domain side here that if they ever do nothing, shut up about Bitcoin and Oma's cake, this had a reel, because they thought it was such a bad idea. And how can we even build this idea in the Federal Reserve? Because they thought it was such a bad idea.
What are the steps and considerations involved in developing and implementing this innovative idea within the complex structure of the Federal Reserve System, and how can we ensure its success while addressing potential challenges and obstacles? So this won't be a controversy. And now here comes the kicker. She was almost kicked out of the room. So it's not just that they laughed at her here. They didn't just ignore her, they almost fought against her. And they also say that there was nothing strategic about this wording, because she obviously pitched it here. He made it very clear, hey, if we use Bitcoin here, maybe we can stabilize the dollar. Apologize, adjust money printing, pull capital into dollars. Use change, maybe we can actually pull more capital into the dollar system again. We wouldn't have to buy the government bonds from the central bank ourselves anymore. Instead, we could maybe handle that through the free market. Maybe we can also get a grip on the 10-year government bonds again, because they're currently being massively devalued since no one is buying them anymore. Such things would be handled very, very carefully here. But she says, no, here you would just be ignored. And the highlight, actually, is that she was almost thrown out the door. I mean, just think about it. It's not just ignorance here. It's really bad. The stock market is fighting Bitcoin. Anyone who suggests Bitcoin here is fought against, is just being thrown out of the house. I mean, I can understand it up to this point. I mean, they want to maintain the status quo. It's like when someone, I don't know, let's say sells horses. And then someone comes along and says, hey, I have a car. That's way better. Could you take a look? The technology of the car, couldn't we change that here? Couldn't you maybe sell cars or something like that in the future? Then he naturally first says, hey, what are you doing here? Piss off, get out, I don't want cars. People prefer old ways, unaware cars exist. Cars are much faster A to B. They would rather rely on old technology. They would rather rely on horses. They do not yet understand that there are now automobiles, that there are now cars. 10 times faster, 100 times faster, getting you from point A to point B. And it's the same with Bitcoin. The Federal Reserve still doesn't get it, that there are savings technologies here. They're 10, 100, 1,000 times more efficient, and on top of that, is the Fed worried about their jobs here too? Because clearly, if there's Bitcoin here, then everyone at the Fed is out of a job. I mean, just think about it. If a company like Periane Borring comes in and says, are you taking Bitcoin as a strategic Bitcoin reserve? That basically means, hey, you better start looking for a new job. So a bit exaggerated, but there are probably still going to be a few people at the Fed. But the more Bitcoin gets implemented here in the US, the more Bitcoin gets implemented at the Federal Reserve, the more irrelevant the employees become. The more irrelevant Jerome Powell becomes, the more irrelevant. It's all the other Fed people. And it's clear that there are fears for those people. And of course, they will fight back. And it's really important that she says it won't work without controversy. And the Federal Reserve is definitely going to push back against that. When the Bitcoin strategy reserve comes in, that doesn't necessarily increase the chances. In fact, it looks more like this. It's like the whole thing is supposed to be massively fought against from the Fed side. And you're hearing statements like that now, increasingly. These are basically fear statements, defensive statements, or just statements of ignorance that justify this anti-Bitcoin line. And there was a highly controversial clip from AU.S podcast interview where Steve Hink was asked about a strategic Bitcoin reserve. And I didn't even know him before, but he's actually very, very well known here as an economist, as some kind of finance person, whatever, but more from the traditional world rather from the MMT world. Maybe Marcel Fratschers from the USA. No idea if it's accurate. The comparison is probably not accurate. Sorry, I'll probably take back that comparison because I don't know the person well enough to judge that. But take a look at what he said here about a strategic Bitcoin reserve. Because in the end, It's really the same thing, there's just ignorance here. And that's how statements like this come about.
What does the version of maintenance or increase in Bitcoin do? Yeah, right. It puts pressure on the economy because this debt isn't being invested in real capital aspects, producing things. It just settles there. It's like buying old masters. What does that do? It diverts maintenance and debt into old masters that just settle there, never invested in bankable projects that actually produce everything and increase productivity, and so on in the economy. And if we don't increase productivity, we have a real problem, because that's fundamentally what it is. What the improved standards for life and prosperity in the economy depend on, the increase in productivity. So I think that's enough about the street. So I'm completely convinced that it's a stupid idea.
He says the same thing. He says having a Bitcoin reserve is the dumbest idea. He says saving in Bitcoin doesn't bring any productivity to the economy imaginable. He says here that in the end, saving in Bitcoin doesn't bring any productivity to the economy. Because Bitcoin is simply not a productive asset. Because here the money isn't going directly to a company or any kind of investment in the economy or something like that. And that's basically the misunderstanding, because Bitcoin is a store of value, kind of like gold, for example. You could say the same thing about gold. Yeah, gold doesn't bring any productivity to the economy either. But what we're doing now is just printing money out of thin air. We're rolling out new bazookas, we're putting out new money packages. We're basically pumping the newly created money into the economy and thinking, if we print new money now, we can increase economic productivity. To a certain extent, it works. But we also think that we can create wealth out of the printing press. And that just doesn't work. And Bitcoin is, let's say, the valve that shows this excess, or not excess, but it highlights this imbalance first. Because if we switch to a Bitcoin world, then all this asset bubble stuff that's been inflated with money we've borrowed from the future will also. Infinitely high levels of debt, which we don't have infinitely high, but very, very high levels of debt that we've reached by now, and that needs to be set right again. We're in an inflated economy. Bitcoin acts as a valve to deflate this. Inflation. Bitcoin can be the black hole here. Deflate is a weird word, but Bitcoin can basically be the black hole here. That it sucks the monetary premium out of the bond market, the real estate market, the stock market, and so on. Because we're stuck with a lot of money in these asset bubbles that otherwise wouldn't be there. Because our money is broken. We don't have any money that we can really use for the economy. We can't even, let's say, to plan for 2 weeks. I don't know what the inflation will be like in 2 weeks. I don't know how I should adjust the salaries. I don't know how my products in the supermarket will change, because I have inflation all the time. Here, say hi to our ultra bullish dog. What's up? Bitcoin to the moon. Okay, he doesn't get it. Whatever. He's busy with other stuff, chasing other dogs. Or I don't know what with. It's pretty awesome, living life as a dog. Chasing after people all the time and just running around. It's definitely very, very important. As, let's say, a business owner just having planning certainty. Just having a denominator too. That doesn't change every 2 or 3 seconds. And in the end, Bitcoin is the game changer here, because Bitcoin is just here. Basically, it's fixed money that can't be changed. And give it a shot, guys. We have an economy where we have absolute predictability, because we know exactly how central bank policy is changing. We know exactly how the money supply is changing here. We know exactly that we're not somehow dependent on any interest rate manipulations. Economic cycles make us dependent. The economy recovers to the moon. Then we crash into the wall again and stuff. With Bitcoin, we would have something much, much more stable. But you really have to take off your MMT glasses. You just have to go here. Letting go of the belief that in deflation, everything, you really have to move away from that belief. That we absolutely need a flexible money supply. We need some kind of gods here who manipulate the interest rates. And if we don't have this interest rate manipulation game, then the whole economy doesn't work. And when we have a crisis, we have to pump money back in. Endless. But we don't realize that we've basically manipulated ourselves into the crisis through the fiat money system. And that's ultimately the big problem that a lot of people have here. If you're bullish on Bitcoin, use 21 Bitcoin to buy. Can you set up a savings plan? 21 Bitcoin, where you can easily and simply buy Bitcoin. Can you set up a savings plan? You can easily do dollar cost averaging by buying in every month. Of course, you can also set up limit orders, auto wallet transfer, a lot more. With the code Bitcoin, you can still get up to 20% off the fees when buying Bitcoin. See you then. And check this out. You can find the Flower of Life in the Bitcoin Hotel shop. I'll also put a link down below for you. There are some cool Flower of Life t-shirts to really set you up perfectly. See you then. Peace out.